We'll just give it 2 seconds for people to join, and then we'll get underway with the panel discussion this lunchtime. Hi all, my name is Victoria Jones. I'm the National Officer at the FDA and I look after our members in the FCDO. I'm really pleased to be welcoming you to the launch of our latest report, the Agenda for International Development, which is available now on the FDA website and will be circulated to guests shortly too. Earlier this month, we marked the 1-year anniversary of the merger of DFID and the FCO, and while a lot of work has been done internally to start to bring those two sections of government together, there are still a lot of outstanding questions as to how the functions of government will change, but also how civil servants will adapt to new ways of working. Hopefully we'll get into some of that this lunchtime with our excellent panelists. Before I hand over to my colleague Dev to start the conversation, I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the work of the FDA and run through a little bit of housekeeping too. So what is the FDA? We are not the Food and Drug Administration. We are a trade union representing almost 20,000 managers and professionals across the civil service and the NHS. We're a pragmatic, solution-focused union, which is why we turned our focus to this research. Our members in the FCDO have recently come together to form the Association for Development and Diplomacy, one of the largest sections of the union. And we really wanted to understand how the merger was impacting the work they do, as well as getting an academic insight to help us shape our thinking as we lobby and bargain to improve conditions and practices within that new employer. We're absolutely delighted that our friends at King's College International Development are hosting us today. Thank you to them. They helped to put us in touch with a number of academics and contacts who gave their time for this project and help us to shape our thinking. This launch also coincides with the start of their Interrogating Development series of events, which actually starts next Wednesday, the 6th of October, and features some of the leading thinkers in the international development community. More information will be circulated after this event to attendees, and you can find details on the KCL website if you search Interrogating Development. Moving on to today's session, can I start by asking that you use the Q&A function to raise any questions as our panelists get into the details. I will then put those questions to our panel later on. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by 3 excellent panelists this lunchtime. Abby Baldumas is an aid policy manager at Bond, who connect organisations working in international development across the UK. Abby and her colleague Paul kindly gave their time to us as contributors to our report, and we're absolutely delighted that Abby is here today to share her more recent perspectives as well. Tim Durant is an Associate Director at the Institute for Government, former civil servant and a long-term friend of the FDA. He's seen his fair share of MOGs and moves, and I'm looking forward to getting his take on the impact such monumental shifts have on the civil servants doing their jobs within changing departments. We're also joined by Sir Miles Wickstead. Miles is a visiting professor at King's College and has spent time working in both FCO and DFID during a lengthy civil service career. As an associate member, he'll also be giving his time to talk to members next week about the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, something you'll notice he's passionate about in his interview in the report, and no doubt he'll squeeze a bit into the conversation today too. Finally, I also wanted to introduce Dev Bara, who I'll hand over in a second to chair our panel discussion. Dev joined the FDA in June this year as our first ever summer intern, having picked over 200 prospective candidates to the post. When we pitched for this additional resource, I wasn't quite sure how it would play out. It's new for us, and we didn't want to run an internship that lacked clout. Reading over the report, I think it's clear that Dev's contribution has been nothing short of outstanding. I genuinely mean that. He really has led this project from reaching out to prospective contributors to surveying members and putting it all together in a report that is wide-reaching and ambitious. We're absolutely delighted that Dev agreed to chair today, and welcome all of our panelists. Dev, can I hand over to you, please?
Sure, and thank you for that introduction. So I guess I'll start with the first question that I want to address to all the panelists. I guess, what are the major challenges facing the new FCDO post the initial merger?
So shall I have a first go at that, Dev? I think there are a number of challenges, I think, in bringing together departments, whichever departments they are, and whatever they're doing. There are different cultures within departments. Resources are clearly important. It's very important that both the diplomacy function and the development function have the proper resources that they need to do the job. There's, as I say, there's that sort of cultural shift of people working together in London, which they have a tradition of doing very closely in overseas posts. I've been both run a development office and been an ambassador overseas, working very closely with colleagues from the other side. And there's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, there's just a huge amount going on, which complicates the whole picture. There's a new international development strategy, which is under construction. There's the spending round, which is about to pronounce towards the end of next month. We have the aid cuts being implemented. We don't know whether the diplomatic sort of function of the SCDO is going to have to be cut back further as a result of the spending review. These are all enormous questions up in the air, which create an atmosphere of uncertainty, which makes it enormously difficult for everyone involved. Let me leave it there for the moment.
I could pick up from there, perhaps. I think maybe perhaps focusing on the development side. I think so. When the merger was announced, Bond produced 3 recommendations about what we wanted to see in the new department. And one was the continued prioritization of poverty reduction in aid. The other was transparency and accountability. And the final one was that development and humanitarian issues were still seen as priorities at the top of government. And in many ways, I think those challenges still feel like they are very live a year on for this new department. I think we were all disappointed at the lack of inclusion of development in the integrated review, and then equally excited to hear about this new international development strategy. And I think a lot of promise and a lot of hope for what the potential of this new department to really build on what I've also experienced from the outside as a close working relationship between FCO and DFID colleagues in the past, to really deliver what is necessary for Britain in international spheres. And I think a corollary to that, in light of the aid cuts, is to continue delivering quality aid, and how to do that with fewer resources. Those stand out as priorities, as does, I think, restarting relationships with the sector. The merger, we did not respond positively to the merger. I think there was a lot of fear around the merger that was exacerbated by the aid cuts, the secrecy around the aid cuts. But I think, again, and this is where things a year on feel very different, I think we're starting to feel that as the department has settled into itself, those are restarting. I'll finish there for now.
And just to add, I mean, I agree with what everyone has said so far. I think 2 extra points I would make is, one is obviously, this is a big moment for UK foreign policy generally. So, we've seen that the launch of Global Britain as this slogan. And the question, I think, or the jury perhaps is still out as to what Global Britain really is all about, and how the government is going to actually implement what that strategy means, what that slogan means. I think we saw today as well the launch of Galactic Britain. So, you can't fault their ambition, but perhaps you can question how much they're actually delivering under these big slogans. And that's obviously to do with this Prime Minister and the changes that we've seen in politics over the last 5 years since the referendum, the UK's view on where it wants to position itself in the world, the relationship with the US having changed, the Australia-US agreement the other week. There are lots of big things that the UK is trying to sort of position itself differently on. And how it does that, how the FCDO makes that happen, is one of the big questions that the department is still facing. But the second point I want to make is sort of a slightly more kind of a longer term historical point. Is there's a question that's been raised about the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whatever it's called, going back to at least Blair, if not before, and how that department relates to the Prime Minister, because for a long time, the Prime Minister has been the sort of key actor on foreign policy. You know, he or she is our representative on the world stage. Number 10 takes a huge role in driving foreign policy, managing relationships with world leaders, as you would expect. But that does raise the question, sort of who is the kind of, or which bit of government is the driving force on foreign policy decisions, on foreign policy strategy. And I mean foreign policy in the broadest sense, so thinking development, thinking trade, thinking defense, all of those aspects, as well as sort of classic diplomacy. And that relationship, I think, is still being worked out and is in a state of flux. But as I say, it feels like it's a decades-long change where the sort of the gravity, the center of gravity on Whitehall and foreign policy has moved from the Foreign Office, or under whatever name, to number 10.
Those are all really excellent points, and I actually wanted to see if we could explore those further. I guess I'll direct this particular question to Abby. You mentioned this case of restarting relationships between the wider development sector and civil servants. I was wondering if you could expand upon that and see if there are any immediate issues that might arise or any things that are going to continue on in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all kind of recognize that there were, differences of opinion, I think, or not differences of opinion perhaps with civil servants, but I think the merger, the lack of consultation around it, what felt like a lack of consultation around the aid cuts, that was decisions that were taken at the political level, had an immediate knock-on effect. I think there were concerns about transparency, the different culture of transparency between the FCO and DFID and what could be lost. The Aid Transparency Index has clearly different ratings for those two departments, and I think there were a lot of concerns there. What followed with both the need to reduce aid in 2020 and then the subsequent decision to cut the target was an almost stoppage, I think, in opportunities to communicate and speak, and I think this was felt keenly by the civil service as well as by the development sector as something that was not how things worked best. I think there is a recognition on all sides that engagement of experts, with different perspectives, is a way to get better policy outcomes. And that wasn't happening for the majority of the past year. I think really positively, once we saw the vote in Parliament, once it felt the decision on aid cuts was firmly taken, I think we've seen some really positive changes, a real kind of, not a return to business as usual at all, and perhaps that previous business as usual will never return and we'll all learn to work differently. But for example, we have had extremely positive engagement with the team working on the international development strategy. We're setting up a series of deep dives that we're inviting them to. And then also more recently, and I know a lot can be criticized in Afghanistan, and I don't want to get into the politics of Afghanistan or what might have happened there or could have happened. But in terms of what I've seen from the teams working on Afghanistan was an immediate response to setting up high-level engagement with organizations working on the response, looking to find shared solutions to the challenges of the humanitarian issues facing that country. And I think that feels like both the sector and the civil service working in ways where they show their best selves, their best sides.
Oh, thank you for that. And it's really useful to not only members within development, but also civil servants who play a crucial part of that relationship. I guess another point that I'd like to expand on is, I think, Tim, you mentioned that the Prime Minister for a long time has kind of driven and navigated foreign policy. Do you think that could be maybe a major challenge that this new FCO department faces currently and within the future?
I think it is always going to be a question for the FCDO. I mean, you know, a prime minister is by their very nature, they are the figurehead of the government. They are the most recognizable member of the government, and foreign affairs is sexy and interesting, and prime ministers enjoy it in a way that maybe they don't enjoy sorting out fuel crises or whatever, you know. So there is always going to be attractive to a prime minister. I think. And that's not a bad thing for the FCDO. It does just mean that there's a question about sort of where the political balance lies, and the risk, I suppose, from the point of view of an official in the FCDO is that inevitably, when information moves into number 10, it becomes less nuanced, it becomes more summarized, it becomes sort of, you know, condensed, just because number 10 is very busy and people don't have a lot of time to think through it. So think through all the details of an issue. So there's a risk that sort of, you know, the kind of, I don't want to use the phrase lowest common denominator, but something along those lines is what makes it into decision making. And actually the expertise and the knowledge that is in the whole of the FCDO isn't able to translate across into that kind of much more heated political decision making. That's an issue for every part of government, you know, and trade-offs will be made in number 10 that won't necessarily be the decisions that individual ministers or officials would have wanted, having, you know, looking at it from their point of view. But that's how our government works. I think the interesting question for the FCDO now is the role of the new Secretary of State and what she will be thinking about. So we're two weeks after the reshuffle now. It's still early days, but there was a sense, we were talking before this call went live, we were talking about the impact of the reshuffle, and my sense was very much that Dominic Raab had a particular vision for what he wanted the FCDO to be doing, how he wanted it to be structured. You know, he was there as Foreign Secretary before the merger was announced and was very closely involved in how the two departments came together. Now with Liz Truss, this question about, will she have a similar level of sort of interest in how the department is structured, but also will she, even if she has a similar level of interest, will she have different priorities, and how will that change? Because the department has spent a year sort of building itself, working to Raab's vision, and now if they have to make quite a big directional change because the new Foreign Secretary has different priorities, that I mean, that's difficult for any department, whether they're new or whether they've been established for a decade. So it's and how she relates to the Prime Minister and how she influences his thinking on foreign affairs and vice versa is going to be a big question for the FCDO.
Oh, thank you for that. I guess to the next kind of big question to explore, and I'll direct this question first to Abby as it relates more to development specific work, but opening up to the panel overall, is what will the future impact of this merger be on development initiatives?
Well, if I could predict the future impact, I would probably be paid a lot more. But I can talk about, I think it's worth talking about it in kind of two ways. I think one is the sort of the fear way. I think there's a lot of fear around the future of development in the sector. There's fear that development is being sidelined, as I've already mentioned. There's fear that development will be instrumentalized. There's fear that we're losing expertise, that the civil service is the DFID expertise, that even FCO expertise is lost through the process of a merger because there's fewer resources to go around. And again, as I said earlier, I think there's real fears around transparency. Real fears that a lot of decisions are being taken without proper oversight, or that they could be. And I think a lot of these fears are mixed up with not just the merger, but also the aid cuts, but also, and I think, you know, Tim rightly mentioned, we have a new foreign secretary, and certainly in her public statements coming into office, trade was still very much at the forefront of her mind. And I think there are concerns, again, about what that means for quality aid, quality development, and that kind of reputation and leadership that the British government has built up. At the same time, I think there is also really positive potential there. I think I mentioned Afghanistan earlier, but I think what we've seen there in the development and humanitarian conversations is foregrounding of human rights and civic space issues, of media freedom, that even in cross FCO DFID meetings on other crises, weren't necessarily always given equal weight. And so I think there is real potential to do the best of both diplomacy and development within the department. But that takes a lot of work. And I think a lot of those decisions and whether that actually happens is sits with political actors who have a lot of competing priorities. But I think we will all see what the future holds with the new international development strategy.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just come in there, Dev, I very much agree with what Abby says. In particular, I think the merger between the two departments will put an increased and very welcome focus on issues like media freedom, rights, etc., which the Foreign Office has always been extremely strong on, really good on that. So there is absolutely real potential to work very closely together in areas which we have perhaps not focused on sufficiently in the past. As I said in my opening remarks, the problem is, however good the ideas you have, if you don't have the resources to back them up, you have a problem. The Select Committee just a few days ago put out a very strong statement on the impact of cuts. Here we are saying we're a global power, we're going to do all this stuff in East Africa, and you look at the country allocations to East Africa next year, and they have dropped remarkably strongly. I mean, but over more than half in countries like Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a disconnect, and that disconnect, I hope, will be addressed to a degree in the new international development strategy, but perhaps even more importantly, in the allocations under the current spending review and resource round. Because unless you can get a better match between the ambition and the resources, you will be left looking rather stupid, frankly, and we've got to put the resources in to doing that. Not just, by the way, just let me make this point here, not just FCDO, but our whole international posture. We need to be supporting organizations like the British Council, our soft power institutions, our universities. That is what helps make our reputation as Global Britain. Unless adequate resources are put in to supporting those organizations too, as I say, we're going to be left looking, as if we're standing on one leg rather than running along on two.
If I could just, oh, Tim, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to add about, in terms of, how this affects development in particular. I think, I'm sorry, I'm going to make a geeky point about how the department is structured, but I think it's interesting that they made the decision, as I understand it, not to have sort of a foreign affairs half of the department and a development half of the department, but it's fully, or the objective is that it's fully integrated. There is a Europe bit, there is an Africa bit, there is a Middle East bit, and Asia, so on. And the former DFID and former FCO officials work in those sort of geographical directorates, sections, however they're called. And I think that has to be a good thing from the point of view of bringing together the two former departments rather than leaving them feeling as two separate halves of a new organization. I think that's helpful. The other point I would make is, I was looking through the ministerial portfolios, and as far as I can see, each minister, and there were a lot of junior ministers at the FCDO, I think 10 points if you can name them all, but they all seem to have some kind of development related themes, policy areas in their portfolios. Even ones like, for example, Wendy Morton, I think, is Minister for Europe and the Americas, an area of the world that we traditionally do less development stuff in, obviously, but she also has responsibility for other kind of thematic development things. So the fact that it cuts across all of the ministerial portfolios and that the department is structured in such a way where these people are working, hopefully, literally side by side, or at least when they're all back in the office, they can be working side by side. That, I think, has got to help bring together the two previous departments rather than meaning that it's two kind of ships in the night, hopefully.
Yes, and I would agree with that. I think especially where we're moving towards, as as a wider development sector, this kind of recognition about the greater need for localization and local knowledge, and where that expertise is really valued. I think the downside of the way the merger has been handled is at the very top level, the lack of, cabinet level representation for development, and what that means in terms of, given the huge number of issues sat on the desk of the Foreign Secretary in a normal year, let alone in a post-pandemic COP, et cetera, et cetera. I think there is concerns that it's very easy for development to fall by the wayside at that top political level. And I think that's where some of the concern lies, by having all ministers responsible for different parts of development. That is a huge value, but by having no minister responsible for developments, there is a risk there that I think also needs to be acknowledged.
So that's actually really interesting. And I think from those discussions, there were a few aspects I'd like to explore. And I think, Miles, you mentioned within your discussion that soft power organisations like the British Council have a role to play in development initiatives. I was wondering, would you be able to expand on what their potential or current development initiatives are?
Yes, I'm happy to say something about that. A number of colleagues and I have been talking for some time about this kind of 3% envelope for our international efforts. 2% on defence, 0.7% on official development assistance, and 0.3%, which would wrap up everything that the Foreign Office needs to do. And let's not forget, the Foreign Office budget has been salami sliced over the past 10 or 12 years. We tend to forget this. No wonder, there are going to be risks about this integration, because the former Foreign Office will, of course, want to use official development assistance resources if they can, if they are not being adequately funded themselves. So it is absolutely crucial that all those different elements, are funded properly. You asked me specifically about the soft power bit. So we got the 2%, for defence, which is a commitment, an ongoing commitment, which we're exceeding. The 0.7% commitment, which the government has said it's committed to going back to. Let's hope that happens sooner rather than later. And then this idea of a 0.3% commitment, which would support the Foreign Office in what it's doing, stop any further salami slicing, and would allow the British Council to get adequate funding, the BBC World Service to get adequate funding, schemes which link up British universities with universities in developing countries, etc., which are fantastic. You look at the numbers of, if we're talking about global Britain and soft power, you look at the number of global leaders who've been educated at British institutions. It's extraordinary how many prime ministers and presidents have been to British universities and have that kind of sense of what it is to be British and want to, naturally build partnerships with us. So it is really, really important in this whole discussion, I think, that all these elements of the international agenda get proper funding. I think a lot of us are going to be watching very carefully to see what happens in the spending review on that. Thanks.
Another interesting aspect that I wanted to touch on was, I think, Tim, you mentioned that from my understanding, that the way the FCAO was ideally meant to be organised was by different countries. So people from DFID and the FCAO would work together, focusing on a specific region of the world. I wanted to ask whether you think that would impact incoming civil servants or current civil servants who may only have quite a general knowledge of certain areas, whether it will require more specialisation of different regions of the world.
Good question. I think, people on listening to the call probably know more than I do. But I think for a while now, as I understand it, at least DFID and maybe FCO as well, have been trying to encourage people to specialise in particular geographical themes. I think there's a career anchor idea where people have a particular sort of geographical specialisation. A point that was made to me when I think the merger was first announced was everybody in DFID works with people in FCO, because of the nature of the role and the cooperation between the departments. Not everybody in FCO works with people in DFID, because FCO covers the whole world. DFID is focused on the poorest countries. If you're in the embassy in wealthy, Oslo, well, Oslo, maybe you do development cooperation because the Norwegians are also very active in development. But you get my point. If you're in Paris or Madrid, your focus, or Washington, development might not be top of your list. Whereas if you're a DFID person, whichever developing country you are in or working on, you are going to be interacting with the diplomats as well. So I think that is more of a challenge, perhaps, is getting the diplomat side of the organisation up to speed and cognizant of how the development side works and how their colleagues work and what sort of specialisms and knowledge they bring. I mean, from speaking to people, I believe that is going relatively well, but it's obviously, I think with all changes to departmental structures, it's always a process. It's not an event. It takes time, and just because it's been going for a year doesn't mean it's finished.
Actually, that ties quite well into my larger question, which I'll direct to you first and then to the wider panel. I guess the larger question would be, what is the impact of this merger on civil servants?
I mean, I guess, again, your report makes fascinating reading on that. So I'm encouraging everyone to go and check that out after this discussion. But I think there is always a hit to morale in these kind of events, whether a department is merged, a new department is created, or indeed a department is got rid of. It raises questions about, well, what was my role politically important? Do politicians care about this issue? So there's always going to be a hit to morale in some way. Where it is a merger, I think there's always a concern that it's one department taking over the other. And I think that someone you interviewed or in your survey response made the point that it's felt some people like an FCO takeover of DFID rather than a kind of meeting of equals. I think that's always going to be a challenge. Hopefully that will, again, as I say, this is an ongoing process. So hopefully that feeling will dissipate as the department finds equilibrium. But if we look back to the last big merger, which was when the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy was created in 2016, that was the Business Department and the Energy and Climate Change Department brought together by Theresa May. And that was, again, there was a sense, I think, for a lot of people, it was a small issue-focused kind of expert department, the Energy and Climate Change Department, being swallowed up by this bigger, more sort of pushy, perhaps less, less passionate believers, perhaps in the issue in the business department, and so there's a parallel there. And those senior officials, we spoke to some people involved in that merger. There's some research we did a couple of years ago, and they worked really hard to try and tackle that feeling that it wasn't the business department swallowing up the energy department and all of the energy and climate change people kind of being scattered to the four winds. It was a meeting of equals. They could learn from each other. Obviously, energy is a huge component of business and how the economy functions, and climate change is an issue that affects everything, and business needs to get up to speed with tackling climate change. So they were able to make the case that this was sort of, a learning work going both ways. Hopefully FCDO have been able to do that as well. When we looked at that, we looked at responses in the Civil Service People Survey, which is an annual survey that the Civil Service runs. And there was a big drop-off when the merger first happened as to people saying they had a clear sense of what their department's objectives were. Huge decline between what BIS and DEC thought in 2015 and what officials at BEIS thought in 2016 and 2017. But then a couple of years later, by 2018, it had actually got back to where it was. So is this, there's always going to be that fluctuation, that dip. And I think the FCDO has seen something similar, not perhaps a huge, as big a dip as BEIS saw, but there has been a drop in the number of officials who say they have a clear sense of what their department's objectives are. But I would expect that will right itself and they'll be heading back up to the high levels that FCO and DFID were on in a couple of years, once we've got through the spending review, once this international development strategy has been launched, once Liz Truss has bedded in as Foreign Secretary, that kind of sense of what are we here for and are we all working towards a shared objective will be back, but it does take time.
Just to make a couple of points on that, Tim, I very much agree with what you said. You know infinitely more about this than me. There have been quite a lot of people leaving the new FCDO. In my understanding, over 200 people have left, and they've been almost exclusively from the former DFID. Those are figures that have been given to me. I'm not sure whether they're true or not, but that's what I've been told. I think it will be so important if this new department is to retain the credibility of the UK as a kind of development superpower, that it retains the expertise that it has had in agriculture, in natural resources, in engineering, in health, in education, in-house. You can send certain functions out to top consultancy organizations to run programs, etc. But it is absolutely vital that if the FCDO is to maintain that reputation, it needs to retain that capability and capacity in-house. And my fear is that if there are headcount restrictions, going right across the civil service or whatever, that apply to the FCDO as well as to other departments. I mean, it was always very bizarre when DFID was the 0.7%, and that was agreed, that there were cuts in the number of people to administer the programs because of an overall headcount constraint right across the civil service. That made absolutely no sense at all. So I very much agree that this will take time to work through. I hope that morale will pull back as programs get going, as the impact of some of these cuts go through. But it's something we've got to watch extremely closely, because we have a world-class diplomatic service, a world-class development organization. And it's really important that those people feel that they're continued valued for what they do, and that we maintain the quality of the programs which they implement.
And I guess, Abigail, from your perspective, what do you think are some of the impacts that our civil servants will face because of this merger?
I have very little to add to what's been, I think, quite a thorough and stellar response from both Tim and Miles, but I would just reinforce that issue of expertise. And I guess from the outside development sector perspective, I think confidence to re-engage. I think I talked about engagement before, but it has felt in the midst of the merger and all the work that's been happening internal, all the work there has been, strangely for a very externally focused set of departments, a lot of inward looking over the past year. And I think I would hope that the other thing that they gain as the merger fades into the distance and as things become settled, that kind of confidence to engage externally, to be confident in their evidence in their knowledge about what works, in their expertise, and in what both sides of this new department are bringing to solve global issues and global challenges.
So
could I just add, sorry, Dev, could I just add, so a couple of thoughts sparked by what Miles and Abby said. So on the staffing point, particularly the fact that it's mainly people from ex-DFID officials who have left. A point that was made to me by someone, I can't remember who it was, but that international development is a global market. There are NGOs, there are international organizations. It's much easier generally to work for another government's international development arm than it is to work for their foreign affairs ministry, because of national security concerns and whatever. So if those experts that Abby was just talking about, if they are feeling slighted, if they're feeling that this isn't a priority for the UK government in the way that it was a few years ago, they can go elsewhere. They can look at the UN, they can look at NGOs, wherever it might be. There is a much more sort of a bigger job pool for them, I think, than there is for diplomats. Diplomats, they work for their government. It is generally protected to nationals, and therefore there is going to be a kind of disparity between what people can go on to do. So that will affect the changes, I think. And I wanted to also talk about Miles's point on the sort of increasing budget with program budget with decreasing people and administration budget. And that's something we see across all of government. Government loves saying, oh, we're going to spend loads more on whether it's high-speed trains or the NHS or international development in the past, but we're not going to employ more bureaucrats because that's a waste of money. We don't want more bureaucrats. It's all going to go to frontline services. And actually, if you don't employ people to manage that money and to deliver those programs, then that's a false economy. You are going to the trains are not going to be on time. The international development programs are not going to be delivered. It is going to you do need some bureaucrats to manage these increased budgets, and I think we see that across the piece and across all governments. You can understand the sort of the good PR behind that kind of messaging, but actually it doesn't necessarily lead to the outcomes that they would hope for. I think a related point is on the 0.7 in particular. It's worth remembering that after the coalition came in, DFID was the only department that had a rising budget. Education and health were protected in the austerity movement era, but DFID was, because they were working up to hit 0.7, which I think 2013 was the first year they hit 0.7. It was going up at a time when everyone else was flat or going down. So the sort of impact, the DFID officials are coming from a very different history than the rest of Whitehall. I think, most of Whitehall through the last 10 years has been dealing in an era of constrained budgets. And this isn't criticism of DFID officials, but just the about turn that the development bit of FCDO has had to go through in 12, 18 months it's just such a huge change. Not only, obviously, 0.7 would have been less because the economy shrunk because of the pandemic, but then to go down to 0.5 and do it in year, so you're taking money away that you've already actually signed up for, is a massive, massive change that understandably people weren't expecting and it was a big shock, I believe. So I think that kind of context is worth bearing in mind as well.
That's actually really useful and actually really interesting for contextualizing, I guess, the various perspectives that each department has. I guess that ties quite well into my next question, and I'll direct this question to Miles first and then open up to the panel. It's been discussed that civil servants often sometimes aren't always involved in decision-making processes, and that's quite a high up-level thing. But I guess the question that I want to propose firstly to Miles and then to the rest of the panel is, how can civil servants rise to the challenge of trying to embed development initiatives within the FCDO?
Victoria said at the beginning that I would probably talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is my cue, I think, because I do think that these Sustainable Development Goals that we are supposed to be reaching by 2030 absolutely are something that we should build our development programs around, build our diplomatic programs around, but actually build a lot of what the rest of government do around as well. The SDGs bring together issues around climate change and the environment, around poverty, around prosperity, around peace and stability. They are, in my view, the key to this. And it's also a key, I think, to closer working across government. Because if you've got, the whole of government working towards these sustainable development goals, both on international policy and on domestic policy, you have a kind of integrated framework there for making progress both on those international and domestic issues. So that, Dev, in my view, is the answer, not just within the FCDO, but to see this sort of integrated approach. And bear in mind, that our relationship with poorer countries is not just about development and official development assistance. It is about the fact that we, connive in tax havens. It is about the fact that, we make arms sales to countries which misuse them. It is about, a whole host of issues out there which have an impact on these countries, but fall to other government departments to police and monitor. So absolutely, the Sustainable Development Goals, in my view, give us that paradigm for progress, both in this country and globally.
Oh, thank you. I guess, Abby, from your perspective, how would you think, or from your perspective, how do you think civil servants could try to help embed development initiatives, I guess, more concretely within the new FCDO?
Sure. I think the politics of it often deals with the what. So we have the kind of 7 strategic priorities that were set out by the previous foreign secretary. And I think a lot of focus is on what the new department will do in diplomacy and on development. But I think the civil service really comes into its own in the how. I think when they bring out their expertise, when they bring their evidence, when they bring their particular approaches to solving problems and making things happen and putting things into practice. And I think there's a lot, there are limitations to that, obviously, but I think I think both departments have a lot of resources at hand. I think taking, the sustainable development goals are some, but also pre-existing gender equality strategies or disability inclusion strategies or transparency commitments. I think building on expertise in what has gone before and focusing on solving the problems that are being posed to them by politicians is the best way for civil servants to have that impact, because the strategic direction is set. That's the way the system works, and that is the way the system should work. But yeah, I would say through evidence and expertise.
I guess finally, Tim, from your perspective, how do you think civil servants can best try to embed development initiatives within the FCDO?
I'm not sure I really have much to add to what Miles and Abby have said already. I think the point, I guess, in all of that is about joining up with the rest of government. So as Miles said, the SDGs cut across everything that government does, or perhaps should cut across everything government does. I agree with what Abby said as well. I guess the only other thing I'm thinking is in terms of structures, there is the National Security Council, and obviously the Prime Minister is the chair of the National Security Council, but officials in departments that sit on the NSC can hopefully work together to ensure that these issues are looked at in the round rather than in silos. So hopefully that can continue to play some kind of coordinating role, and development hopefully won't be lost now that there is no cabinet level development minister, as Abby said earlier.
Oh, that's right. And thank you for that. Victoria, I wonder if there's any interesting or insightful questions that are been sent by respondents.
Thanks, Dev. Yeah, and you actually just asked the last question I was going to ask, which is around advice to civil servants managing this. So I think you've actually encapsulated that really well. We've had a really good question from Emma, which looks at climate change, and actually it made me think we could do a whole session actually on climate change in this context, because I think obviously with COP26 coming up as well, there's going to be loads of conversations to be had there. And this might be one to kind of for the panel to ponder. But the question asks whether how we'll get the balance right in focusing in strengthening capabilities to address climate related risks. So whether that will be kind of focusing on scientific capacities within countries or regions, whether that will be more kind of UK based. I think that's quite interesting to see how that split will lie. Be good to get your view on that if you've got opinions there. And similarly, and I think this is a bigger question around climate change and our approach more broadly, it's whether we're looking at, responding to issues as they arise, or do we start looking at those underlying structural issues as well? So a really good question there. And I guess, Abby, if I can come to you first on that one, just to get your take on whether you think the key to this is country-based kind of resourcing, or whether it's something that should be addressed from a UK basis.
I think I'm going to end up hedging a little bit on all of that, because I don't think it can be an either or. I think the scale of the climate change challenge globally, I think where we are in terms of the climate emergency, what we've seen in terms of extreme weather, natural hazards turning into emergencies over the past year globally, means that we can't do no one solution is going to be sufficient. I think there has been, perhaps an over-focus historically on some of the easier solutions. And I think we need to move rapidly into some of the more difficult mitigation, loss and damage issues that haven't necessarily been adequately addressed. It's a very unsatisfactory answer, I realize, but I think only a holistic approach, only an approach which brings together, as Miles said, domestic UK approaches to climate, global approaches to climate, and sees it as one set of challenges that need to be answered consistently and in a joined up manner is the only way that globally this issue is going to be resolved in any way that seems or approaches satisfactorily.
Victoria, if I could just sort of come in on the back of what Abby said, I mean, I very much agree with her. I mean, we've got this important notion of global public goods. These are issues that we can only address as a global community, and we can't address individually as countries, or we can't address them satisfactorily and tackle them. So climate change is perhaps the most obvious of those, and other issues around sort of environmental pollution, etc. Health, as coronavirus has demonstrated only too vividly, is one of those things that we have to address as a global community. Terrorism actually is one of those issues too that we have to address as a global community. So we've got to strike that balance, I think, between what our partner countries want, and also, what we think are the right things to do in an international cooperative manner to address those global public goods. And some of that, of course, can be addressed within the UK. The vaccines for coronavirus. Well, the UK made a really important contribution to the development of vaccines, scientific knowledge that we have. Equally, it's no good keeping that to ourselves. We have to share that knowledge with other countries that have the capacity to build those vaccines themselves. And then we have to share it with the countries that are most in need, because until, as people keep saying, until everybody has the vaccine, no one is properly protected. Thanks.
I completely agree, Miles. And I wonder if there is a bit of a lesson to learn there, isn't there, around the COVID response and how that will shape our thinking of challenges going forward. Tim, appreciate, again, it's a very specific question, isn't it? But I wondered if you had anything to add, particularly about kind of how we respond to issues, whether we're responding to something that's happened. We talked previously about Afghanistan and the response to that, or whether it's something actually you can plan for. And I think that's a challenge for the civil service, isn't it, in terms of whether you're kind of responding to something that's happening here and now, or whether you're kind of responding to something underlying. And I think that question, looking at climate change, is the epitome of that, isn't it? I don't know if you have a take on that.
Absolutely. As you say, I think climate change is the sort of, you couldn't come up with a kind of a better essay question, could you, for like a long-term problem? How do you, as Miles and Abby made the point, impacts are global, causes are global, it's unevenly distributed resources to deal with it. And COVID has given us a bit of a test run of, are we actually going to be able to manage this on a global scale? And it doesn't necessarily feel like we've come out of it hugely positively, does it? I think bringing it back to the UK, I think the spending review in next month will be a really interesting moment for this, because politics and government in the UK for the last 5 years, I would say, since the referendum, has been in crisis mode. It's been in reaction. It's been, oh God, what happens now? We don't know what the next 6 months hold. The political system and parties have been arguing amongst themselves. That has played through into what government has the capacity and the bandwidth to deal with. And I think the fact that we moved from, Brexit and the minority government and the hung parliament straight into the pandemic meant that there was never any breathing space. There's never any chance for kind of government and the wider kind of public sphere, journalists and everyone else involved in thinking about these big issues didn't have a chance to collect their breath. And so we've just gone from crisis to crisis to crisis. And actually, the issue that we have with climate change is that it's not a short term, we can solve it now or do something to put a sticking plaster on it. It's we need to implement long-term changes that will cost money now and will reap benefits 20, 30, 40 years in the future. And it's not clear that the state in the broadest sense has the capacity to do that, I think. So I think the spending review as to whether or not the Chancellor and the Treasury can look beyond, the immediate recovery from the pandemic and start thinking about these longer term issues is going to be a really key moment. And the other point I would make, just kind of slightly tangentially off Emma's question, was about, I think, and I'm guilty of it just in what I just said, but there's still a tendency to talk about climate change as if it's a problem in the future. And actually one of the key points that comes out in your report and from news over the last year is that climate change is happening now. It's affecting countries all around the world. It's not just developing countries, not just sub-Saharan Africa where climate change is having an impact. We see floods in the UK, and we see forest fires in Australia and America and Greece and wherever else. And actually, a larger part of the kind of public discussion on this needs to focus on adaptation now and what we can do to manage the climate we have now, as well as trying to ensure that it doesn't get worse. And if I can make a cheeky plug for an IFG event, we held a discussion a few weeks back about what countries can learn from each other on adaptation to climate change. And we had the High Commissioner from Bangladesh to the UK talking about how Bangladesh is responding, and how, this point that Mars made about, SDGs and expertise flowing across countries. Bangladesh is on the front line of climate change, and they have a lot that they can teach the UK. So it was a really interesting discussion. I think remembering that, yes, climate change is the sort of perfect long-term problem that's very difficult to solve, but it's also happening now.
Super. Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I think you're spot on about that kind of reactionary nature of politics in the last couple of years. It's felt quite relentless, hasn't it? And this is a definite shift. There's one final question to finish up on. It's from our General Secretary, so I think I'd probably be in trouble if I didn't ask it, but it's a very good question, just talking around whether the panel think the next big MOG or machinery of government change will be that trade will be added to FCDO. So I looked after the Department for International Trade for 4 years, and it was constantly on our minds whether that was kind of the direction of travel we're going. Dave asked the question, does this make sense in developing coherent foreign policy objectives, or will it skew the development priorities to support British trade rather than on need? I think it's a great question. And Miles, can I come to you first on that one?
Yes, I thought you might. It is a great question. I'm afraid the sort of historical experience of too close a relationship between the Department of International Trade and the Ministry Department, whoever was responsible for aid, is not a happy one. I remember in my own experience when the Department for Trade in the 1980s had a very strong grip on development policy. There was a special facility called the Aid Trade Provision, and that was basically driven by British business and industry rather than driven by the needs of developing countries. And it led to some very poor results, some very poor decision making, ministers being told eventually that one or two decisions they made were illegal. The famous Pergau Dam project, for example, which some people may remember. So I don't think it would make sense from a development point of view to integrate the Department for International Trade into the FCDO, because I think it would continue to run that risk. And I think, I think two things. First of all, the new international development strategy, which is currently being drafted, needs to have the reduction of poverty absolutely at its center. That is what our development efforts are and should be about, and it has to be absolutely central. Second point, to go a bit more specifically to Dave, I think actually there needs to be much more coherence across government, and I think that comes out of what I said earlier around this international development agenda. Departments made by decisions made by government departments right across the board have an impact on developing countries, as I said before, whether it's intellectual property rights or defense sales or whatever. So I think there needs to be a much more sort of coherent, integrated approach. And that's a responsibility really for, Tim will no doubt have views on this, but that should be for Cabinet Office to do. And they've been, over the last few years, they've been so fixated, not through their own fault, on Brexit that they haven't had time really to bring that coherence to the whole agenda. Thanks.
Thanks, Miles. Abby, before I go to Tim on that one for his perspective from a civil service view, what's your take, particularly if we're looking at it from a kind of NGO kind of lobbying perspective? How would that play out for you, do you think?
I think it's safe to say this probably terrifies us. I think Miles has laid out all the reasons why. I think, which is not to say that trade and building strong, just, fair trade relationships with developing countries is not ultimately an endpoint of development. I think that is ultimately where we would want to be, and trade has a huge positive role to play in development. But the idea of subsuming trade interests under the foreign development department, I think, runs all the risks that were adequately outlined. Challenging a focus on poverty reduction, further undermining the interests of developing countries in our development policy as the UK. And I think also, just to pick up on the policy coherence point, I think it's a mistake to assume that the only way to achieve policy coherence is to build mega departments. I think we've spent a lot of time, or I've spent a lot of time in this discussion talking about expertise and specialisms and all of them having value. And I think it's very hard to weigh them equally when there's too many of them, when there's not enough resources to go around, when there's not enough bandwidth to go around. Globally, we have already talked about some of the challenges we are facing, and that requires best and the brightest doing what they are best at. And that often requires specialization. And, you know, cabinet should be doing more to coordinate, yes. And certainly policy coherence has been a challenge for British governments right across. I mean, historically, it's not going to go away. But I don't think what looks like an easy fix of a merger should be the knee-jerk reaction. And I think specifically on trade and development, there are far too many potential conflicts of interest. But I'll stop there.
Thanks, Abby. And I think that point of expertise has really run through this discussion, hasn't it? And I think our members will be pleased to hear that. Tim, I'm conscious of the time, but have you got any observations on that question as well?
I'll be really quick. We've been very much in agreement with each other, so I'm going to throw a cat among the pigeons a little bit and say, well, maybe it should. So I think if you listen to what the Prime Minister said when he announced the merger, he said that the reason he wanted to do it, and obviously he was coming from having been a Foreign Secretary, was that he didn't think the UK was sufficiently joined up globally. And that, you know, the diplomat was saying one thing on the left hand and the aid and development people were saying another thing on the right hand. And I think it's surprising if you kind of pursue that sort of chain of logic to its ultimate end, that he didn't merge DIT at that point. And you can totally understand why he would want to, because if it is all about presenting one view of the UK and UK government views overseas, then why would you not bring in the Trade Department into that? I'm not saying necessarily that's what I think should happen, but as I say, if you pursue that kind of argument to its logical end, I think that's where you get to. I think I completely agree with what Abby said about actually mergers. You know, it's not a solution. You can slice and dice policy issues in departments in many different ways. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It depends on the sort of priorities of the moment. And as we've already said, these mergers can be hugely disruptive. So actually adding something else into the department will probably just add disruption and delay. But from a sort of and obviously Miles makes this very sensible point about Pogao Dam and all of that stuff. There is history here, but from a sort of solely UK interests, one voice overseas point of view, I can't understand why you might do this. And obviously the fact that it's Liz Truss, maybe she will enjoy keeping the trade deals bit. She's clearly had a good time at DIT, so maybe she'll want to keep that with her in her new role too.
You make my paranoia while I was at DIT feel more justified that the move was imminent, so we shall watch the space. I'm going to draw it to a close there, and just thanks to our panelists who've been fascinating, and it's been really good speaking with you about this for the project, and just the conversation today has been great. Huge thank you to Dev, who has done an outstanding job chairing this and done a really great job with the report. Dev, we can have asked for more. You've been absolutely brilliant. And thanks to our attendees for joining us as well and for posing your questions. We'll send out a link with the details of the report, the FDA report, and also it'll have details of the Interrogating Development series from King's College as well. And with that, I will leave you to the rest of your afternoon. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much.